disappear and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It gives me great delight to welcome to this Summer Forum series Andy Heffer. He is Assistant Dean and Professor of English. Am I basically? Yes, okay, getting the nod from the back. Assistant Dean and Professor of English at George Mason University, and is a scholar of Southern literature, is an author himself, and he is going to lead us through this 3-week exploration of Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. So how many of you felt like you were back in your college English classes while you were reading this? Yes, excellent. That feeling may continue a little bit, and that is good for all of us. So Andy, I'd invite you, come on up.
Thank you. Hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, so yes, I'm Andy Heffer. I teach, I'm in the Honors College at George Mason University, so if anybody has a son or daughter or a grandson or granddaughter looking at colleges, you should come talk to me at some point. They should visit with me. That's one of the things I do. And I'm also an English professor. Did my grad work at LSU in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, so a lot of things are on my mind always with regard to our history and our race, but of course, right now, given that I spent 5 years, I met my wife, began my adult life in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I come, with a heavy heart these days. So keep that in mind, and if I could ask you to think about think about my folks down there when you have an opportunity, and pray for them today if you haven't been to church yet, or even when you get home. Okay. So what are we going to do? Why are we doing this? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about. I know not everybody's going to be at all three because it's summertime and it's hard to do, but if you are, I want to give you sort of an overview of why and how we're going to talk about this book and how I like to handle Faulkner and other things. So our goals, really quickly, what are the goals? The goals for all three sessions, and then we'll talk about specific for each one, is really to together do some fun summer reading that isn't, I like to read spy fiction and mystery fiction in the summertime, but I'm going to give you a hard book in the summertime to read. And it's a book that I find, and I may be alone in this, but for me, every time I take on a Faulkner novel for the first time, and it's in fact my area of study, I actually need a group of people. It's very hard for me to do Faulkner. In the short fiction I can do by myself, but I need to be in a class, I need to be teaching it, I need to be in conversation about the book for a variety of reasons to get through it. So one of the things is, let's take this really challenging masterwork of American literature and talk about it together. And then I think to consider, the other goal for these three things is to consider the confusing and contradictory history of race in America that Absalom offers, and to wrestle with its challenges that it offers. This is not a neat singular argument it's going to offer us. It's messy and complicated and opens up more things than it probably resolves. And so that's probably the nature of race in America. And so here's a way to get through that, I think, or at least to open that conversation. One of my other favorite novelists is a guy named Walker Percy. Have you ever read Percy? A good Catholic novelist, right? Another Louisianan. And Percy has this thing. He was a medical doctor. He had tuberculosis. He got tuberculosis during his residency, and he never really got to practice again. And he became a philosopher and a writer. And he viewed the novel, at least in the way he used it, as diagnostic. That we needed a space to think about what troubles the human soul that is not probably our own particular daily lives, because that's loaded with everything else, with the actual things we have to do and the personalities and our commitments to our responsibilities, our own hurt and pain. But how do we think about ourselves as a people, as a nation? The fiction could have this role, that we could step outside of ourselves for a moment and look at a reflection of ourselves, something that approximated us, that represents us, and then work through those things. And that's kind of how I view literature. So I want to give you a little sense of that, how I view literature, and sort of that's the way I talk about books and the way I'm going to ask you to talk about books. That's one thing. The other thing is that a work of literature is both I think there's an old school version that's the product of an individual genius, sort of creative and responding to something, and then that was gone for a while, and it was an object and a text produced by the world that it came from, the time and place and history, and it reflects that. And I kind of think it's both and, right? That we can look at a book and any work of art as a product of its moment, of the way people thought and talked and considered the world in that particular place, in that particular historical context. But it is also if it's a good one, it's a part of an individual person who has some awareness of all those things and is in fact responding to and maybe even trying to challenge them. So we're going to do both those things. How is this a book reflection of its moment in time in history? And how is it commenting on its moment in time? It's both and, okay? So we're going to do 3 of these things. Today, we're really going to talk about how to read Faulkner. Many of you may, there are people in here who have varying experiences with this particular writer. Some of you probably read him for fun on your own and actually better at reading him than I am. And some of you have not seen the Faulkner story since The Bear sometime in 11th grade. So we're not going to make any assumptions. Today's the day where we sort of are going to get on the table ways of sort of making it through Faulkner. Next time we meet, I think that's next week, we'll talk about, I think we called it The People and the Plantations. We're going to talk about particular characters and their perspectives, as well as their perspectives on the place they inhabit. So we're going to talk about place, but we're also going to think about these individual characters. And what we'll see in Faulkner is we're switching between point of view multiple times. So each of these characters represents a different way of looking and interpreting this. This is a mystery story in many ways, and they're all trying to solve it. And so we're going to get their different perspectives because they are all relevant and help us understand these bigger questions. And then we'll build toward a deeper dive in the final session into the history this book is taking on and how it opens it up for us. We're also going to be flexible. So at the end of this, I'm going to give you my email address. I'm going to ask you to have, with questions or anything you want to talk about in the next 2 sessions, we will adjust to make sure we incorporate those things, okay? So a few ground rules, and I like to open with, ground rules is the wrong word. Let's say common understanding of how we'll operate. That's how I do this. So now, this is not condescending. I teach adults, I teach young students, so don't feel like when I'm operating in teacher mode that this is, in any way anything other than me sort of shaping a conversation, okay, and giving us some free space. So my approach as a teacher is to begin with listening. And this is a hard thing to me because I got into teaching because I like to be up front in front of people, and I've had to learn that actual teaching happens when I rearrange the room, which we're not going to do a whole lot of today, and then I sit down and I don't talk a whole lot. The best classes I teach are the ones I don't talk much. Today I'll talk a little bit more, but after that I don't want to talk much at all. So listening, and we will understand that we all bring, there's no set meaning for a work of fiction or even a work of art. There's the author's intent, but Faulkner was drunk half the time that he was writing. So he's a genius, but we're not going to assume that he actually meant what he said. And in fact, if you try to read his public statements contradict themselves. They contradict, if he's talking to a national press, he will seem like a segregationist. If he is talking to the Jackson, Mississippi paper, you might think he's a communist who is and was promoting the miscegenation of all races, is what he was accused of in the Jackson papers. Okay, so he deliberately was a jerk to whoever he was talking to. He was the opposite point of view. So don't try to frame anything about what he ever said, because I've tried, and so have a lot of other scholars, and it makes no sense. So don't. In fact, the book itself is full of contradictions, okay? So instead, we're going to actually value our different perspectives in the room and think that actually is going to get us to a richer understanding of the text. So understand that we all bring different things to the interpretation of the text. Listen. And someone told me this a couple years ago, and I use it all the time. Listen as if the person speaking is very wise. And I tell my students this, even if they live across the hall from you and you know them to be an idiot on Friday night, listen to them now in this context as if they are really wise. And listen with a willingness to be influenced. Okay? A willingness to be influenced. Give people the presupposition, the assumption that they might be really wise, and then you can go back and decide later on. And then try to suspend your own position on anything that's happening in the book. You may have a really hard and fast, I know what this is, but wait a second, and sort of say, okay, maybe, but let me think about something else for a second, okay? So those are the ground rules, okay? Now, I ask this question a lot, but I never do it in I teach at a public university, so I don't get to do it with people in collars, in clerical collars in a room. How many of you read the book? Oh, yay! Okay, or started. How many started? All right, excellent. That's all we need. Very good. How many have it? And who has? Anybody have copies? All right. If you can, and if you come next time, bring a copy. If you have a copy with you, just because it's more fun to have the text with you. Good. So I'm assuming you all told the truth in class. I have no. I don't make that assumption. All right. All I really want to do is start with this basic thing. How did this make you feel? And we're not talking about the big picture. We're not talking about history and race, anything else. We're actually talking about the text and what is your experience of making it through this text. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to get to find 3 other people, or 2 or 3 other people, preferably not a partner or spouse, who are in your nearby vicinity, and actually actually tell each other. And then we'll come back and talk about this as a group. But actually get together and talk about what is the experience of reading this particular novel. And maybe even just the first few pages. When you first open it up, if you want to focus there, that's fine. But that's what I'm asking you to do for about 5 minutes, okay? So find somebody, again, preferably not a spouse or partner, because you may have already discussed this on the way here.
And you can feel free to get up.
Yeah, move your chairs, turn your chairs around. Okay, so I gave you the first little assignment. What if we just go around and again? So I don't have the well, I had a very strange and crazy high school teacher who used to say that when we would do stuff, that the reward would be in, if he asked for volunteers, he would say the reward will be in heaven and in my grade book. So again, teaching at a public university, I only get to use the grade book, but I'm hoping we can get the other one here. So I need volunteers, people to talk, all right? So out of your groups, what were some ideas and some common experiences that emerged that you were discussed? So again, it's the pick me thing. I need people to, engage here. So go right ahead.
Well, our group, we first talked about how much have you read.
Yeah.
One person had read 7 pages, the other person had 1 page.
Yeah.
Very difficult to understand.
Absolutely.
And now I went online to the how to read Faulkner, and there were some very good suggestions there.
Good.
And so the first thing is sometimes it helps just to read it out loud.
Absolutely.
Because you get a flavor for the language that way. Another thing is you have to read it more than once. Mm-hmm. Another thing is, it's not, as you mentioned, it's not a linear plot.
Right.
It's people talking about their experiences. The first chapter is actually a prologue, and it's like a symphony. So you read the first chapter, if you read it out loud, you can start getting the beauty of the language and the characters and the words, but it is very cryptic. It's very hard to understand. as you persevere and go on, then it starts to make sense.
Absolutely. All right, good. So what are some, let's go with some one or two word phrases that would describe the sort of experience you had as when you first encountered this. Anybody? Come on. Yes, sir.
It's like opening the box in a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle.
Absolutely. That's a really good way to think about it. That you're suddenly asked to put these things together.
And nothing fits.
Okay.
Now,
So
the first time you pick up two pieces, you have a huge chance of not getting anywhere.
So what emotions would you, if you would, either this book or that moment, would you?
Frustration.
All right, frustration. That is the number one word. Did anybody's groups that have the word frustration emerge? Okay, frustration is the one I experienced the most when I started any sort of new, like, super modernist text. Joy. Anybody read Ulysses by Joyce? I mean, that is, I will be honest with you, I have a PhD in literature, I do modernist fiction, and I have not made it through in one, I've read the whole thing, but months later I'll pick it up, because I get so angry at it. And I have a PhD, I did a dissertation on Faulkner. The first time I read, which one was it? The Sound of the Fury. The first time I read Sound of the Fury, I literally threw it at the wall. I literally picked it up and threw it as hard as I could out of anger. I was like, at that point I just had an undergraduate degree in English, but I was like, I'm an English major, I should be able to read this. And it's really hard. So frustration. The jigsaw puzzle thing, what else would you, so imagine yourself in that situation. Yeah.
Every sentence is about a paragraph this
Yes.
long, and I don't know that my attention span is good enough to get through this, but I've read about 70 pages.
Okay,
So
good. So the attention span. All right, so absolutely. This is actually, I view as an antidote to, I am, especially right now, I am having a hard time putting down my iPhone and my iPad and not reading news and seeing poll updates. And again, I told you I was from Louisiana, I lived in Louisiana for a while. And so like last week, all I could do was read news. I need a news story. What does people say on Facebook? What are people on Twitter? Blah, blah, blah. And then when I actually force myself and give myself time and say, I'm going to go sit down somewhere for an hour and read this, something happens cognitively to me by the end of the hour where I have slowed down. So I think that actually is, for me, a thing to remind myself in an anxious moment to slow down, and we'll talk about that probably in a second. So the jigsaw puzzle thing, whenever I open a giant jigsaw puzzle, I feel overwhelmed. Did anybody feel overwhelmed when you were like, oh, what am I doing? Yeah, this is an overwhelming text. And the sentences are yeah.
He's not helping you.
No. Well,
The sentences are 500 miles long. The paragraphs go on for pages and pages and pages. He apparently is unaware that there's a quotation mark key on the keyboard.
Yes.
So it's very hard to tell who's talking.
Absolutely.
And it'll be one person at the beginning of the sentence and another person at the end of the sentence. So, I mean, you have to sort of think he's doing it on purpose.
Okay, and absolutely right. You have to think and that's an important thing, is that, again, I think, you know this, so there was a period of time where the death of the author, we don't care, authorial intent, or, the intentional fallacy, we don't really care. And everybody said that, but no one actually, I think, in deep at their hearts really believed that in literary scholarship. They were all so you have to get, it's not the only thing. Texts do work in the world. So regardless of what Harriet Beecher Stowe, we know what she meant to do with Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it isn't what it's doing now, right? I mean, there was a political intent with that novel, and then 100 years later, 150 years later, it's a different thing the novel does in the world. So you have to think about both things. But if we were to say this, that there might actually be an intent. If we were to say that, oh yeah, the guy won a Nobel Prize, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. What I'm experiencing now was intended. Or maybe you don't need to worry about that. Just like, this is happening and it's not bad. This is not a messy writer. This is not a failure of a novel. This is actually the thing it does in the world. The experience I'm having now is the experience I'm supposed to be having. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind, and we'll come into that in a second. Why? Like, why, given the things we're talking about, should that be the thing you're experiencing, okay? All right, but let's try to figure out what we know from those first few pages, okay? And I'm actually I'm going to read for just a moment. If you have your book, open it up. This is my very well-worn copy of, which has different pictures than many of yours have, on the front. All right. From a little after 2 o'clock until almost sundown on the long, still, hot, weary, dead September afternoon, they sat in what Miss Coldfield still called the office, because her father had called it that. A dim, hot, airless room with the blinds all closed and fastened for 43 summers. Because when she was a girl, someone had believed that light and moving air carried heat and that dark was always cooler, in which, as the sun shone fuller and fuller on that side of the house, became latticed with yellow slashes full of dust motes, which Quentin thought of as being flecks of the dead, old, dried paint itself blown inward from the scaling blinds as wind might have blown them. There was a wisteria vine blooming from the second time that summer on a wooden trellis before one window, into which sparrows came now and then in random gusts, making a dry, vivid, dusty sound before going away. And opposite Quentin, Miss Coldfield in the eternal black, which she had worn for 43 years now, whether for sister, father, or not husband, none knew, sitting so bolt upright in the straight, hard chair that was so tall for her that her legs hung straight and rigid as if she had had iron shin bones and ankles, clear of the floor with that air of impotent and static rage like children's feet, and talking in that grim, haggard, amazed voice until at last listening would renege, and hearing sense self-confound, and the long-dead object of her impotent yet indomitable frustration would appear, as though by outraged recapitulation evoked quiet, inattentive, and harmless out of the binding and dreamy and victorious dust. All right. That is, let me see, is there an actual period at any point? There's one period, so that blown them, that's a first sentence, and then after that's all one sentence. This book does, in fact, and I can't remember what page it's on, contain the longest sentence in the history of American literature. It's like 3 pages. This book does, yeah. I mean, you just Google longest sentence in history of in American literature, in English literature, and it shows up here. It's English language literature, actually. All right, so it's hard to follow that, particularly if you're reading it for the first time and you're not reading it out loud. And it does require one to go back and review. But let's actually think about what we learned, if we were to think there is in fact a plot to this. Amid everything else, the plot is not actually very complicated. Now, they have to figure it out. It's a mystery plot, but it's not like even the Maltese Falcon. I mean, it's way easier than that. And in fact, I'll share this, you can pass this around. This was in the New York Times. They wrote, this is about 7 years ago, they had a piece on this novel by a guy named John Jeremiah Sullivan, who's a really great essayist. And they put this little triptych together. And this is the whole plot. This is it. Now, Miss Rosa isn't on here. You get Shreve, who shows up later, who Quentin's talking to here instead of Rosa. And he'll be talking to her to Shreve for the second half, his college roommate. Talks to Miss Rosa essentially for the first half, Miss Rosa and his father, and then he's talking to Shreve for the second half. But this is essentially the plot of the book in pictures, and that's it, okay? So actually, as you're going along, one of the things I would recommend is actually have a piece of paper or write it in the margins. I like to write in margins. Library books, don't write in the margins. Sticky notes. When I use library books, I use these little Post-its. Those are fun. Write down actually what you know, because what plot points are given up. So what do we actually know from that first paragraph? We have a name, at least.
Miss Caulfield's been there for 43 years.
Yeah, we have Miss Caulfield's been there for 43 years, and she's very small. She wears black all the time.
There's at least 3 characters that have died that she might be wearing black for.
Okay. All right. And we have Quentin. And we know that we have Quentin, right? And we know what time of year it is, right? We know. All right, so everything else in there. Now, you can sit down and try to decode it. And if you are a master of scripture and antiquity and Shakespeare, and you have all of those things in your belt and Southern history, then you probably can begin to peel back every single reference and allusion in here, but that's not necessary to read the book. I'm actually really bad on the antiquity stuff, okay? Just sort of a hole in somehow I got out of a class somewhere along the line that in retrospect I should have taken, okay? I don't have that stuff, which Faulkner has just, just is a master of every sort of ancient myth that he likes to pull from. But don't worry about that. I mean, it's fun if you know that stuff and you can pull it out, it's great, but it's not that important. All the other detail besides, Rosa's been mourning for 43 years, she's talking to Quentin, all that other stuff is evocative. They're images that help create a feeling, okay? And not all of them have to work on you at the same time. They're all sort of together working, okay? So if you don't get one of them or one of them doesn't stand out to you, it doesn't matter. Just sort of take the, it's an evocation rather than a sort of logical or precise thing. So what do you get? Think about the paragraph I read and the incredibly long sentences, okay? Overwhelm, frustration, those are the experiences you have, but what is that, as I read it aloud, what does the room feel like? Hot? Still and stagnant. Depressing. Stifling.
Funerary.
Okay, absolutely. So do we have movement? Do we have hope?
No. From what we hear.
No. For so far, we have none. In that room where Miss Cofield lives, or Rosa Cofield lives, if she's been wearing black for 43 years, do we call that moving on? Okay.
Did I miss what happened 43 years ago?
No. You just know something happened 43 years ago. And as you get through this first chapter, though, you pretty much do actually get, if you go back and read the first chapter, he is telling you every single thing except why. The mystery is why this happened. So does anybody want to say what we can't go through enough time to sort of read aloud the entire first 3-4 paragraphs, which that's crazy. We can't even read the first 3 paragraphs aloud because it would take too much time. But that's the nature of the book. All right. What do we know? If you want to go through, if everyone wants to look and see try to remember what do you know for sure? Sorry?
Life exists outside of that room.
Okay, so there's something outside of there that Miss Caulfield has sort of pulled herself away. How about just plot-wise? Who are these other things, if you've gone through it a little bit?
Well, I thought the hyphenated word, not husband,
Yes.
was strange
And
sexist.
Yeah, well, don't expect Faulkner to be really good on gender. We'll talk about that in a minute. There are actually some really complicated and contradictory. How about that? Yeah. Right. So let's look here. We know. How about any other characters' names? Just flip through it. Literally flip through this. Well, actually, I'm going to read a little bit of the second paragraph, which is 2 pages. I'm not going to read the whole thing. All right. Her voice would not cease. It would not vanish. There would be the dim, coffin-smelling gloom, sweet and oversweet, with the twice-bloomed wisteria against the outer wall by the savage, quiet September sun, impacted, distilled, and hyper-distilled, into which came now and then the loud, cloudy flutter of the sparrows like a flat limber stick whipped by an idle boy, and the rank smell of female old flesh long embattled in virginity, while the wan, haggard face watched him above the faint triangle of lace at wrists and throat from the too tall chair in which she resembled a crucified child. And the voice not ceasing but vanishing into and then out of the long intervals like a stream, a trickle running from patch to patch of dried sand, and the ghost mused with shadowy docility as if it were the voice which he haunted where a more fortunate one would have had a house. Out of a quiet thunderclap he would abrupt, man, horse, demon, upon a scene peaceful and decorous as a school prize watercolor, faint sulphur reek still in hair, clothes, and beard, And I'll stop there for a second, and I'll talk about why I'll stop there for a second. So this, yeah.
Yeah, all of a sudden, it's not Quentin, the pronoun he no longer refers to Quentin.
No.
It refers to Colonel Sutton.
Sutpen. The man-horse demon is Sutpen. Okay? And let me say this. I am not, when I read aloud, not going to read the N-word aloud. Okay? Now, in a classroom setting, I usually have a discussion and we talk about it, and I ask students are never allowed to read that word out loud, but we do have a discussion about and why the word is there, what the choice was. Was it a choice? Was it someone just not thinking and being racist themselves? Or are they doing something with the word? And we're going to, if I have time to talk about that today, I will, but I think we'll probably hold that off until next time about how we deal with that word in this text. I'm not going to ever read it out loud, okay? So that's why I stopped where I was reading for a moment. So we know that Sutpen is the man-horse demon who emerges in this story as this figure, and we know how we figure, do I remember this, how Rosa, and it's important just to get these details down, how Rosa is related to Sutpen. Yeah, sister-in-law. So her older sister, this all sort of emerges in this first chapter, her older sister, who was much older than her, 20-something years older, married Sutpen. Sutpen came out of nowhere with a group of if you know history, it's obvious. If you know the sort of particular history of the transatlantic slave trade, there's enough here to tell you they're Haitian slaves. Later on, it'll specifically say that they're from Haiti, but you'll get to that later. That Sutpen shows up in 1830s in this town with these Haitian slaves well after, right, we're not supposed to be importing, if you know the history of the American slave trade, it is no more slaves are supposed to be coming from outside the U.S. at this point. However, they very much were. And so just contraband smuggled in, whatever else. He shows up with these slaves and just sort of, they don't know how he has this money. He buys up this land and builds this giant house and starts this empire. Has 2 children and it makes it clear by the end of this first chapter there are at least 3 children. There is his 2 white children that we definitely know about, who are Henry and Judith, and there is Clytemnestra, or Clytie. This is where Faulkner loves his Greek antiquity. He has his daughter by one of his slaves, who is his house servant, Clytie. Okay, so we have those things all revealed here, and we have a sense here of what is the mystery that this chapter sort of reveals to us, and I just want to make sure we all have this before we move forward. What's the mystery?
Well, from way back, they all accepted all the words, all the view.
Oh, right. So, yeah, absolutely. So there's this thing we're going to have to work through with the history, but what is the actual, good old-fashioned mystery plot?
Well, why did the 2 young men who went to the Civil War but one killed the other when they came back?
Right. Okay, so we have a murder here. We have Henry Sutpen killed Charles Bond, his friend, and who was engaged to Judith. Okay? Why?
He was mixed race himself. The victim was mixed.
So and this all will emerge here. Now, here's the. Really want to, if you don't want it to be revealed to you naturally as you read the story. There's the chronology at the back of the book. That Faulkner provided. I mean, that's his authority. This is not an add-on. This is his intent for you to have this, so you can read. Yes.
Well, before the mystery of the lineage, I was interested in why the French architect went with him and subjugated himself for 2 years during the building of it and never left the planet.
Well, he tried to leave.
Well, yes, he did.
Yeah, and they treat him like a raccoon. So.
It's also unclear
What was
why
the
Rosa
whole
Cofield's
detail?
father allowed this guy to marry his daughter
Yeah.
in the first place.
It's going to be, there's some suppositions, but we don't know. There's a lot we don't know, right? And as we work through, we'll have to think through What are the gaps that Faulkner leaves that he doesn't explain? And what are the things we just get through different people's perspectives that we aren't sure if that's the truth or not, that they're making assumptions based upon what they view as are they assuming on the basis of just their reasoning that must be what happened, okay? But those sentences, we don't have a whole lot of time, so let me say this. Think about that structure, that frustrating, overwhelming structure of those sentences. Given what we said, this is going to be about fratricide, Absalom. We'll talk a little bit about Daniel and the brothers and sons and fathers in a moment. But this sense of we're digging into our history, this historical mystery that's from Quentin's perspective is 60 years old. When Faulkner's writing is 90 years old, because Quentin's in 1909, and then Faulkner, this comes out in 36. So it's about a 90-year-old mystery from his perspective, and from our perspective, much older. That overwhelming, that sense of stagnation and stillness that come from Miss Rosa, who is this, who's sitting childlike, looking like a child, never having grown up in this room with nothing happening. Overripe is the word that keeps coming up. Think about that in the context of the topic. Because Faulkner doesn't use this same style in everything, right? Sometimes his sentences are really long. He uses different words and complicated words, but things can be a little bit different in everything. Why in this particular context? Right? And that would be a question I'll leave you with. Think about the nature of history and of historical consideration and how time and events layer onto our interpretation of it, okay? And then I'll leave you on this. It's not supposed to be easy. What Faulkner is asking us to do is to be unsettled, to be uncomfortable. That's really hard, right? To be uncomfortable. But this topic requires us to have a willingness. If we're going to confront our history of race in the country, it requires us to be willing to be uncomfortable. Okay? So we'll leave it there so that we can all get into the church. So next week.
One thing before we go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I'm also not going to presume that you all have, that you know who Absalom is out of the Bible, or that you, in preparation for reading Absalom, have gone back to the Bible to find the story of Absalom. So here's this quick summary for you. This comes out of 2 Samuel. Okay, so that's in the Old Testament, so let's just give us our basis there. 2 Samuel. Absalom is the third son of King David. King David, you may recall, had multiple wives, and he had multiple children by those multiple wives. Okay, so Absalom is not the child of Bathsheba, who's the most famous of David's wives, but there's a conflict that happens between Absalom, the third son, and Ammon, who is the first son. And the conflict happens because Ammon takes a liking for Tamar, his half-sister. Okay, so the genealogy here is as confusing as Faulkner's genealogy as well. So we have Ammon, first son by one wife, Absalom, third son by another wife, and Tamar, daughter, by Absalom's mother. Okay. Okay. Yes. So, again, this is in 2 Samuel. You see it in chapter 13. The conflict in this happens because Ammon has not only taken a liking to Tamar, but then devises a way, with the help of a courtier, a way for her to come into his room. He is trying to seduce her. She refuses to be seduced, and so then she is raped by him. Tamar lets her brother Absalom know that she has been raped by Ammon. David does not know that Ammon has raped Tamar. Okay, but Tamar is totally distraught. over this, and within the context of the time, half of the being distraught by it is because Ammon, having raped her, then totally rejects her instead of marrying her, which to our way of thinking is, oh my God, how gross, and yet within that context is not so much in that realm. That would have been the right thing to do in some ways, and from Tamar's perspective would have been the right thing to do. So again, our mores and morals do not entirely fit that, which is why one should take caution in applying morals out of the Old Testament into today, but that would be an entirely different forum. Anyhow, Absalom does know, however, that Tamar has been raped by Ammon, devises a way in order to kill Ammon. It's a revenge killing for having raped Tamar. David is distraught at Ammon's death. David and Absalom then go to war against each other. In the end, Absalom is killed not directly by David's hand or by David's men directly, but as they are being pursued. Absalom was known for having this long hair. He gets caught in a tree while his hair gets caught in the branches of a tree while fleeing, and is hung from this tree as his hair gets caught, and the horse keeps going, and it pulls him into like a Y in the tree, and he dies in that way. David, in the end, gives this incredibly heartfelt prayer for Absalom that mirrors in some way the prayer that he had for Bathsheba's child, who has already been born and died before this Meshuggah all happens. Okay, so again, you may want to go back to Samuel, 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 13, in order to read that. But that is a piece of what Faulkner is alluding to, perhaps presuming that his original audience has read more of the Old Testament deeply than we in this congregation have done. Many of them probably were Baptists and Methodists, and were digging in deep in those stories. There is one more point that I would just want to lift up for you, which is that after, this is 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15. And so this is after Ammon has raped Tamar. Then Ammon was seized with a very great loathing for her. Indeed, his loathing was even greater than the lust he had felt for her. So there are also very interesting issues of defilement going on. And if there were more time, I would tell you some of what Paul Ricoeur has to say about defilement, but there is not time today for that.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything?
I forgot to give you, if you have pen and paper, I can give you my email address if you want to email me questions, or you can email
You
Heather,
can email me
Heather.
at the church, and I'll send them along to Andy.
Okay, so it's...
So come on back next week for the second session. And then August 7th here, we're going to do something else. But then coming on back, the third session will be on the 14th.
I'll be at the beach on August 7th. So.
Go ahead, give us your email.
Okay, so it's AHOEFER at gmu.edu. AHOEFER at gmu.edu.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for participating. Thank you for coming, and thank you for talking.